Learning CSS is one of the most powerful things you can do to level up your skills as a web designer. And as it relates to WordPress, CSS is not always necessary, but even still with page builders, it is extremely helpful to understand and know how the buttons in your page builder are correlating to real CSS on the front end. And there are many times when you've probably experienced this, your page builder doesn't allow you to do the things that you want to do. So in this video, what we're gonna do is start from the absolute basics and build our way up. So if you're somebody that wants to learn CSS from the ground up as it relates to using it in WordPress, this is the video for you. To start off with, you need to be comfortable with your browser's inspect tool. Now, in my case, I personally use Chrome, and many other browsers have kind of a Chrome feel to them with their inspect tool. Firefox is very similar, so this is a valuable tool for you to know and really get comfortable with. So here on my screen, what I'm going to do is just right click anywhere on my site, and down at the bottom, you can see I have this inspect button. And what that's gonna do is open up an elements tab for me here. So this may look a little bit different for you. Sometimes it will default to the bottom, but in my case, I prefer to have these sidebars on the right. And what we're looking at here is the actual HTML of the site. So this may look a little bit scary if you don't know HTML and CSS, but you can just highlight these elements and get an idea of what they're doing and which element is which. You'll get really comfortable with this really fast. The thing that's really important to look at here though is as I click on different elements, you can see their styling over here on the right-hand side change. So this styles tab is the actual CSS of the site. And of course, this site here is relatively basic, but you can see on my button is where it starts to get interesting. So you can see where my background color is set, my padding, and all the different effects that I've used to achieve that particular layout right there. And in my case, I use generate blocks. So those controls in the back end of generate blocks relate exactly to what you're seeing here. And this CSS is being written for you just like your page builder by clicking those page builder buttons in the back end. So the Chrome Inspect tool is extremely powerful for a number of reasons because you can see the CSS that's written for you as you're making changes, but also you can look at other parts of your site to try to understand and troubleshoot and figure out why something is working in the way that it is, or perhaps not. So you can see here, I set some padding in the back end, and when I hover over this container, you can see a green representation of that padding, and then the blue is my content area. So this is extremely helpful so you can get a visual representation of what's happening. And then of course, you can click in this area and write additional pieces of CSS. Now, this is only saved for your specific browser session, but if you know you want to make changes, you can look at them on the front end in real time. The other thing is I can also look at these values and I can change them. So if I knew I maybe wanted to see what 6 EM looks like, in generate blocks, I can see that in the back end, of course, but you can make changes here in the inspect tool to see them in real time. So the inspect tool is something to really get comfortable with, but quite honestly, there's not any better way to get comfortable with it rather than just using it, but we're gonna spend more time in here, so I wanted to introduce you to this quickly. Switching to the back end of my generate block site here, if I click on a container and let's say I scroll all the way down in the advanced tab, then you can see that there's two main areas for us to pay attention to. For now, we're gonna focus on the HTML anchor, but there's also the additional CSS classes, and we'll touch on that in a little bit. The HTML anchor you're probably familiar with because that is where you could add a jump link or a skip link to have a button scroll you down the page. So let's say your anchor here was welcome. What that's going to do is set the anchor, but that's also going to set the ID of the element. And that ID is unique. So with this ID, we can use CSS to target only this specific element. And of course, it also doubles as that anchor link so you can scroll to that automatically on the front end. Now, your IDs are typically going to be unique across your site, so they don't necessarily have to be globally unique, but in terms of across your page, I wouldn't want to set this other container also as welcome. I might give this an ID of, something like welcome inner. Although there's really no reason for me to do this in practice, I want to demonstrate to you that these anchors are typically unique. And so you want to be mindful of that because the idea is that you're going to target that individual element and nothing else with the ID in CSS. If we contrast that with classes, then we're able to add that class to multiple different elements and change the styling in one place. And anywhere that class applies is going to update across our entire site. So on the front end of these containers, we can actually see that that's how Generate Blocks has set up a lot of these elements. So let me go ahead and update this. And here in my front end, if I refresh, then I'm going to just right click over here and say inspect. Or the other thing I can do is I can click on this little select an element pencil and I can move my mouse around until I get to what I want, which in this case is this container. So if I click on it, then you can see I have this ID of welcome, and that's the one that we just set here. So this means this element is now unique. And if I applied CSS to this ID, it would only apply to this specific container and nowhere else. However, if I contrast that, you can see a lot of these divs here have classes of something like GB-container. They have GB container and then a more unique class, but all of these share a class. So there's going to be some level of styling that's applied to that class, and it will be carried over across everywhere that class exists across your entire site. This same approach is going to apply to things like buttons. So again, if I click this little arrow icon up here and I click on my generate blocks button, you can see I have another class here called GB button. And in the case of generate blocks with global styles, this is exactly how the global styles are applied. There's going to be a class that's applied to every element where you set that global style to appear. And behind the scenes, all that's happening is CSS and classes. That's it. So let me show you in the backend an example. Now, what I'm going to do is in the backend create a simple little grid. And in this grid, I would typically just style these with the built-in controls, but I want to demonstrate to you what this class can do. So if I go into the backend, let's add a new container. And in my case, I'm going to use text expander to add in a container just really simply like so. And I'm just going to pop in another container, duplicate it 3 times. I want to set this inner container to a display of flex, and then we're going to go to space between, and then our column gap is going to be 24, and then I'll set these containers to be something like 32% width each. So keep in mind, all of what I've just done is applying CSS with those buttons. So let me give these a background color so we can actually see them real quick. We're just going to go with a slightly gray like that, and let's give them just a little bit of padding here so we can actually see them on the front end. And if we update this, then we can refresh. So now we can see these containers here on the front end. We have our 3 gray boxes down there, but let's say we wanted to add our own custom class to this and we can apply some styling. That way you can see a real class in action. So what I need to do real quick here is on these containers, let's just say I have a very specific card shadow, like a box shadow that I want to add. So on this container, I'm going to scroll down, and in the advanced tab for the classes, I'm just going to type in card shadow, and that's the name of my class. So I would just need to simply apply it to those 3 containers, nice and easy like so. And then I can update this. Now remember here on the inspect tab, if I add CSS anywhere in this right-hand column, it's not going to save. So this actually isn't applying it to the backend, but I want you to see what will happen here. So if I just go ahead and target one of these elements, all I need to do is just add my class here. So this is going to be .card shadow. And I promise we're going to get to syntax and stuff here in a minute. I just want to show you how this is going to work. So if I added in a box shadow, we could go with 1 pixel, 5 pixel, 10 pixel, RGBA, and then we'll just make this have a really deep black effect like that so you can actually see it here in the front end. And as you've seen now, because we have that class added, all 3 of those boxes get our box shadow. And we could even go as far as to overwrite the padding. So in this case, if we change our padding to 5 EM on all sides, then you can see our containers grow quite a bit. So that's really where the power of classes kind of kick in CSS. But because we've covered now IDs and classes, there are very specific use cases for both of them. So sometimes you might even combine classes and IDs together. So now that we have that padding applied to this particular card shadow class, the other thing I wanted to look at is this ID of welcome real quick. So if you look, the containers really are just divs with a container class applied to them, because you can see the little grid we built down here has very similar looking classes, but the difference is, remember earlier we added the ID of welcome to this particular element. So if I were to use a little bit of CSS and just target my welcome container like this, then nothing I'm going to do will apply anywhere else except on this welcome container. So if we said, padding something like 3 EM, it actually reduces because that container was set to 4. But if we go to 6 EM or, even 8 EM, something like that, then you can see it's only applying to this particular ID. So classes are more global and will apply to multiple elements, and then the ID is just a single element. So that's really foundational and super important for you to keep in mind as we move forward. Another thing for you to pay attention to real quick that I want to point out is that if we look at this ID that we created, IDs are referenced with the little pound sign in front of the element name here. So you can see that pound sign is the ID, and all of these classes are going to have a period in front of them. Now, sometimes you're going to see classes referred to without a period, like here in the actual element. And for instance, if you recall in the backend, here in generate blocks, there is no period in front of the card shadow, but just in general, think of IDs having the pound sign in front of them and classes having the period. Another type of styling that you might want to do is to regular HTML elements. So if we scroll up here, this heading has an H1 tag, and we can easily find that on the front end. So if I just scroll up a little bit, I can click on this and you can see that element has an H1. And in GeneratePress, these are the default styles that it sets us up with right out of the box. But you can see that I could target specifically that HTML element, and it doesn't have to be an ID or a class. So if I wanted to target all paragraphs across my site, I could simply just add in a P tag here. And maybe I want this to be something like a font size of 3 rem or something insane like that. Now, all the way across my entire site, those root HTML elements like paragraph, H1, H2, and so on are going to collect that style. Now, this is not something I am going to do in a global sense typically because like the GeneratePress customizer allows me that visual control over those elements and it will do it for me. So most of the time it's not really necessary to do that, but I just want you to understand that we have IDs, we have classes, and we have these root HTML elements. And we can style all three in one CSS rule. You might mix all three of those sometimes. Now we need to cover where to actually put your CSS inside of your WordPress site. So you'll remember by this point that I've mentioned a couple of times, if you put it in the inspector, it's not going to save to your actual website. So we're going to look at a few different places. So if we were to go ahead and just move into the back end of our site here, in most themes, you're going to be able to go to the Appearance and Customize panel, and then you can go to the Additional CSS tab. Now, this is going to be attached to your theme, so if you change your theme, this could have some problems. One benefit here is that you typically get a live preview. So again, if I were to type, H1 and font size of something like 6 rem, then I can see that update in real time on my page here, which is really handy. What I don't like here though is that this editor window is super narrow and I don't have control on the conditional places that maybe I want some code to apply here, but not there. We don't have that in the customizer. So for me, where I really prefer to add custom code is in a plugin called WP Codebox. Now, there are many others like this, such as code snippets, but for me, WP Codebox is the best balance of features and control. Developer is really active and the plugin is priced affordably, so I think this is a great way to do it. So what I would do in this case is I would create a new snippet and I would call this something like site-wide CSS. This type we're going to change to CSS. And then there's a bunch of other options which are not really relevant here, but all I need to do is simply just save this and turn it on. And now I can start writing my custom CSS here. The other thing that's really great here in WP Codebox is I also have the live preview like I just showed you in the customizer. So all I need to do is turn on this auto reload changes, simply need to save this, and then I'm going to open up the little preview tab. And it is a little bit scrunched like before, but I can just simply hide this or make my browser width a little bit wider, and it's going to be perfect. It's going to give me more space here in the code editor and also in this preview window. But again, just to demonstrate, if I just type something like H1 font size of 6 rem, I simply save this, and as soon as I do, it updates on the front end. So this is my preferred method because I can also go down here to where should this code show up. A little bit of CSS is going to have pretty much no performance impact of any kind. But if you start to get a lot of style sheets or you have very specific code like let's say for gravity forms or fluent forms, it probably only makes sense to load that code where those forms exist rather than everywhere across your site. And I can choose that here. I can go to custom, open my condition builder, and I can say, location is everywhere, front end, admin, logged in users. There's a lot of flexibility here. So WP Codebox is definitely my preferred way to do this. Now, the other thing about WP Codebox is as you're learning CSS, it's really helpful because if I start typing, it will give me suggestions of what code I can use here. So, if I start typing color and press enter, it's going to give me all of the default color names like you can see. And this is extremely valuable to help you troubleshoot and make sure your syntax is correct. However, I would actually recommend you turn that off early on. And the reason is it's better to be able to draw that from memory because when you don't have these luxury tools like this, in say somebody else's site, or if you're writing something manually, it's really good to have these committed to memory and know the proper syntax. So this is really a luxury thing that sort of counterintuitively, I would recommend you turn on as you get better at CSS. So now we're going to move into the proper syntax of a CSS rule. So the first bit of your CSS rule is going to be the selector. And if you recall, there's 3 major types of selectors. It's those classes, the IDs, or the HTML elements. And we can combine them in some capacity, but as you've seen me do a couple of times, I really just need to come up with the selector that I want. We're just going to keep it easy and start with our card shadow class. So because we're targeting a class, we need to start off with a period. Then we're going to type the class name exactly as we entered it. So card-shadow. And CSS syntax in terms of spacing and tabs is relatively forgiving, but when it comes to proper syntax, you definitely need to make sure that you watch out for curly braces and semicolons. So we're going to get to that now. So you don't actually have to add a space here, but I would really encourage you to get in the habit of making this look clean and be far more readable. So what I'm going to do is add in a space, and then I'm going to add an opening curly bracket. Now in WP Codebox, it automatically adds the closing bracket, which is super handy. So all I'm going to do is just simply press enter, starts us a new line, and it pushes that curly bracket down for us. So this is how I would encourage you to write your CSS rules to keep them really clean and easy to understand. Now we need to decide what you actually want to style. So this can be any of the styling properties that you're probably familiar with already, like colors and backgrounds and all those sorts of things. So we're going to keep this basic to start off with, and let's just change the text color of this particular element. So we're going to go with something like color, and you can see there's my suggestions again. So I'm not actually going to use them in this case. I just want to type this manually. So after you enter that property name, you need a colon, and you, again, don't necessarily have to add a space, but I like to do that. So color, colon, space. Then this is going to be the value of the property. So in the case of colors, it can be hex or HSL or RGBA or any of those. So let's just say maybe we want this to be something like, I don't know, purple. We can add in that color name, or again, hex, HSL, whatever you want. Then to close this particular line, we need to add a semicolon like that. And if you don't add that semicolon, it's going to break everything underneath it. That's why it's called CSS, Cascading Style Sheets. So this is a properly formatted CSS rule. We have our selector to start off with. We have our opening and closing curly brackets. We have the property we want to target, and then we have the value of that. Then last but not least, we have our colon and our semicolon. So this is a very basic example. And if you find CSS from somewhere else, in WP Codebox, you can actually click this little button that says Format Code, and it will help you understand how to properly format this. Sometimes you can make mistakes, and if you accidentally tab in a couple of times and you want to reformat that code, this is a really valuable tool for you to be able to do that. So let's go ahead and save this CSS. I want to make sure this is applying everywhere. And then in the backend here, we need to add an element inside of this container. So we're going to go with the headline here and just change this to a paragraph. And then I'm just going to add in a little bit of text. Then you can see it's not purple here in the backend because the way that Gutenberg adds some extra classes, it's not going to show up properly. So what I'm going to do is just simply update this, and we can go take a look at this on the front end. And as you can see, it's a little bit faint, but our font size there is purple. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and set this to preview, and then I'm going to scroll down. So that actually looks better because the background's a little bit darker. Now, of course, it's really common to want to style more than just one particular property like color. So if we want to add more, we don't have to add another entry. You don't need to add another card shadow like this. We can add as many lines as we want inside of this. So what I can do here is go with something like font weight, and let's say maybe 700. Let me go ahead and delete this. And then if we save, then we can see that our font weight is increased exactly as we wanted. So again, this rule can accept as many different lines of styling properties as we want. We just need to make sure that they all follow the same convention of the name. Then we need the syntax here with the colon, the property value, and then the semicolon to close that line. So if I were to delete this semicolon and save this, then you can see not only do I not get my purple color, but I also don't get my font weight. So if you find yourself with CSS rules not applying, you need to just double check your syntax because, again, like I said, tabs and extra spaces are not going to matter. But in this particular case, with these colons and semicolons and your curly brackets, those are critical. And there you go. You've written your first line of CSS. You've targeted a class and you added some styling to it. Absolutely awesome, right? So now that you've completed your first class, the next thing we want to do is take a look at styling IDs. So it's very, very similar in syntax, but again, just remember, when we're looking at an ID, we're just simply going to add in the # in front of that selector name, which if you recall, we set the section in the backend from earlier to the ID of welcome. So what we're going to do here is on that # just type welcome. Then again, the space and the opening and closing curly bracket. We can press enter to give ourselves a new line. And remember that welcome container was right here. So let's just say we want to do something like a padding left. Then we need to do our colon followed by whatever we want this value to be. So you could say, 8 rem or something like that. We can simply do Control S on our keyboard or click on save. And there we go. Now it's just going to target that specific element. If we contrast that with something like the class that we know is on all of these containers, which is GB container, if we go ahead and save that, then everywhere on our whole site, obviously this looks extremely wonky, but we've now set that rule to apply to all of those classes. So again, I'm just going to undo that quickly, but there you go. You can see the difference between classes and IDs. So now that you understand the difference between IDs and classes, what I want to do is show you a pretty cool feature that exists in WordPress. You might have used this before if you've dabbled in CSS, but this is an example of looking at classes and how to apply styling. So if we go take a look at the homepage of this site, and again, I'm going to right click and go to inspect. Then if I scroll all the way up here, when I get to the actual body tag of this specific page, WordPress adds quite a few classes into this body class. And what I can see here is that I have this class called page ID 7, and this will allow me to apply CSS only to this page and its elements. So if I were to just simply copy that out, I could come over here into WP Codebox, and I can add that in. Now, of course, I just copied it out of the front end, so there's no period. So I need to make sure to add that period in front of the class. And at this point, what I can do is add in another selector in here to actually do what I want. Because if I added a rule like, let's say, text color, then it's going to apply to every element on this page, not just a specific element that I want. So let's go ahead and say something like this H1. We have this CSS introduction H1. So I'm just simply going to add in that in front of it. Now you can see that I didn't add a period or a space here, and that's because it's an HTML element, so it doesn't require that. We can just add the name directly in front of it like so. And then in this case, maybe let's just say we want it to be a color of, I don't know, maybe something like blue. We can just save this, and there we go. So what's happening here is this CSS is making sure that this class is present somewhere on the page, and beneath that class, there is an H1. And if that rule is present, then it's going to change this color to blue. Now, if we were to just quickly demonstrate this, I'm going to go into the backend, and let's say on our sample page here, if we added in a headline, we set this to an H1 that just says, I won't have a blue color. We can update this and go take a look. And there we go. That heading is not blue. However, the one on the front end is blue, and that's because we use that CSS rule. So that is how you can start combining CSS rules, and this in itself is an entire other lesson. Now with that, let's go ahead and dive into this world. So what we've just touched on there is the idea of specificity, and that's not just a cool word, but it's a crucial component of CSS and something you really need to learn early on, because otherwise you can just be fumbling around with different rules and not getting the styling that you actually want. So one thing that's worth pointing out is the way that CSS is written. So again, with this rule from before, the page needs to have this class somewhere in its HTML, and beneath that class, there needs to be an H1. Now, when I say beneath that, what I mean is that we have this body tag in the HTML, and nested down beneath it under many, many, many steps until we get to this H1, that is inside of that class. So adding more rules increases the specificity of that rule, so that's going to override something else. One other thing I want to touch on with specificity is in this code here, if I were to change this, let's say I had a class that's just called my custom class. Again, what's going to happen is this class needs to exist on some kind of element, whether it's a container or some kind of block, a div, anything like that. And then beneath that, somewhere in your page, as a child, it needs to have that custom class for this code to exist. But if you want to, you can target an element that has two classes, and it has to have both of those simply by just subtracting the space between the two of these. And now what's going to happen is if there's an element that does not have both of these classes present, then the rule is not going to apply. So that's one tiny nuance of specificity, and this starts to get extremely deep, and as you build out more content, it's going to start to make sense. So there's a lot of other really fantastic rules, and there's other operators and all kinds of really, really exciting and cool stuff with CSS, but I wanted to quickly explain that. So if I go ahead and save this, then you can see our heading here actually changed back to blue because there's nowhere this rule currently exists on our site. One other thing that I think is worth pointing out is that we can also use an operator that is a direct child. And this is really helpful to give yourself a bump in specificity, but not be overly kind of, grabby. So what I'm going to do is in the backend, I'm going to go back to my homepage real quick, and I want to add in a custom class. So here in our welcome container, underneath this container, let's go ahead and add in a class down here, and this one we'll just call my custom class, like that. So we just simply need to update this. And here in WP Codebox, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this so that we know our class is present in this container. And now what I'm going to do is, in this particular instance, I'm going to change the rule to say welcome. And then with this, we want to make sure that this is only applying if it's a direct child. So we can use the greater than arrow here, and we can type my custom class. And what this rule is meaning is that the ID has to have a direct child directly underneath it in the code that has this class. So we can save this. And then there we go. Now all of that font on the heading there and the text is changed to blue. Now in this particular case, I could get away with just targeting the ID, but there are some cases where you might want to have this extra flexibility to make sure that your rule applies properly. And you can combine lots of these operators. So again, it starts to get extremely deep, and we're going to keep it kind of simple here and stop because we can start to go crazy. If you'd like to learn more about CSS, please consider signing up for my CSS Made Easy course. It's going to be coming soon. Right now it's in pre-production, and you can sign up to be one of the first to be notified when that pre-sale goes live. If you have other questions, please let me know, and I'll be glad to create other content around it in the meantime. But that CSS course is designed for beginners to learn CSS and apply it to your WordPress website. So I hope that I'll see you there. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.